Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. You are in the session Show Me the Numbers, Measuring and Encoding Equity. This is one of two concurrent panels, so hopefully you're in the right place. My name is Erin Evenhouse. I'm a program manager with the Shared Use Mobility Center. I'm a Caucasian female with shoulder-length brown hair wearing an olive shirt. And we're here today for about 45-minute conversation about measuring and encoding equity. Have some fantastic speakers joining me here today. Their full bios are listed below, very accomplished, so check them out. Stefanie Brodie is a research practice lead with Toole Design. Hannah Twaddell, principal transportation planner with the consulting firm ICF, and then Shared Use Mobility Center's own Lauren McCarthy is our strategic lead of California and Western programs. So part of the description that we had here was, do we have the data that we need to measure equity and equitable outcomes as key performance indicators? If not, how do we get it? And breaking that down a little bit, we know that it's not just about measuring the final product, but sort of like what do we do along the way to measure equity, feeding into our programs, our projects, our policies. We heard a lot about this in the first session. A lot of different ways of kind of the same way of stating what we measure is what we value. And if we value equity, then we need to measure it. But what does that look like in different stages? Before I get too far into that, question for our panel. What's an area where we're doing at least relatively well in measuring a project or program's equity impact or potential impact? And where do we need to do better? And I'll hand that off to Hannah first.
All right, thanks, Erin. Great to see you. Great to see everyone. This is fun. I hope people will post lots and lots of discussion in the chat. It'll be fun to see the conversation pick up and keep going from where we were earlier today. We need your help. We need each other's help. I've done a lot of research, particularly looking at how metropolitan planning organizations, the regional transportation planning bodies, make decisions and conduct analyses around equity and how they incorporate that into their plans and their decisions and the projects that they fund for regional transportation investments. And to a certain degree, also how state departments of transportation conduct a similar process for statewide transportation investments. And so based on some of that work I've been doing with Transit Cooperative Research Program, National Highway Cooperative Research Program, and Federal Highway Administration, I think I'd say that, gosh, I think some of the things that we're doing well, I would say, at least making an effort. Perhaps for no other reason, in some cases, sadly, that we're required to by law, but MPOs and state departments of transportation, because they receive federal dollars and have to allocate them and make decisions about them, are subject to Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which spawned and created a lot of regulation around how the planning process and the decision-making process need to happen for transportation. The regulations that have rolled out over the years, the sort of famous environmental justice executive order that Bill Clinton signed in the 90s, and then a couple of others, and guidance that's come out, rulings and so forth, mostly around that transportation agencies pay attention to, mostly around defining populations that they have to really pay attention to for equity considerations as racial and ethnic minorities and people of low income. Most agencies also pay some attention to persons with physical disabilities, partly because of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and older Americans to a certain degree. So I think there's, across the board, for the most part, almost every transportation agency that I've looked at is at least nominally making an effort and documenting something. They're creating, public participation policies and plans that include some level of assessment and analysis and discussion of those populations, at least in their region, and who they contact and who they are. I think where we probably need some improvement, which most of the agencies I've talked to don't disagree with. They want to improve and they don't feel like they know how very well, is kind of implementing that in a meaningful way. So incorporating the qualitative input you get from good public involvement and stakeholder involvement into a very data-driven quantitative process that's gotten even more so over the last few years, with performance-based transportation planning really taking hold as a practice. Really giving credit to that qualitative information about people's lived experiences that's valid, but difficult to quantify and regionalize, in a computer model. And then within the computer model, just as another, related, what we are having trouble with issue is just defining the quote populations appropriately to begin with. And I think one of the ideas that I've been starting to really come around to is that I think by just putting forth a process over and over and over again that talks about targeting our analysis to certain populations, I think right off the bat, that's setting us up for kind of looking at it through the wrong lens. It's like turning the binoculars and putting them on the wrong side and wondering why everything looks sort of small and not right. I think instead of just trying to parse out different populations and sort of set people up in special separated groups and then sort of just run an analysis that may or may not be meaningful, starting with what are the barriers to equity and equitable access to opportunities in the case of what transportation agencies are supposed to be able to provide. Just what are the barriers and at all to everybody? And then, we can sort of talk about how those affect different cultural and ethnic and income levels and everything else, ways of people are different. But I kind of feel like starting with focusing on the barriers and the challenges that everybody faces, and then figuring out how those barriers affect some people more than others might be a better way to go about it, rather than just sort of starting off by saying these people have problems or these people are the problem. I think that really sets us up for a not good conversation.
Let me mute myself first. I totally agree with you, Hannah. So a little bit about myself. I started my research in equity analysis and trying to, as you were saying, Hannah, help NPOs identify ways they can incorporate equity into long-range planning. And one of the big takeaways that I had was that we might be looking at the question the wrong way. So I think that one of the things that we've gotten right so far is that we're getting a lot better at identifying populations that have been historically excluded, that have been marginalized, and naming them and bringing them into the conversation. So I think that we're doing a much better job at that. But how we then incorporate that into analysis, I think if we're talking about equity, it's not just we're doing an equity analysis at the end of the project, that we're doing it at some point within the project. Really, it should be we're looking at this plan or this program through an equity framework. So we're building the result to be more equitable, to have more equitable outcomes. In order to do this, whatever impact we're looking at, if we're looking at access to opportunities, if we're looking at safety, if we're looking at any other desirable outcome that the transportation system might provide, we should be looking at how those impacts are distributed and how they might be different, and where there might be disparate impacts, and who might be burdened or might not be experiencing those benefits. In order to do that, we need to start with what that impact is. So like flipping those binoculars around and understanding what does the transportation system look like, and where are the gaps, where are there big differences between those who are experiencing the most benefits and those who are experiencing the least benefits. And who are those people who are experiencing least benefits, and how do we improve their experience in order to get to a place where we're having more equitable outcomes.
Yeah, and I think another place, and I'll just jump in and then flip it to others, but the way you mentioned something about outcomes, you know, and really focusing on outcomes, and that's one of the other big challenges, just technically, for our profession in transportation planning, is that our measures, and I'm sure we talked about it some at earlier sessions already today, but our measures of success that we're required to report to federal agencies and so forth, primarily still are about the facility system performance in a few very selected categories of, you know, congestion and safety, and, you know, outcomes like air quality are fairly well embedded in the process. But a sort of finer grained outcome of air quality on specific neighborhoods is not quite so easily ingrained, but people are trying to do that. That's a good example of taking, you know, something that's beyond a sort of point-to-point piece of information about the performance of the infrastructure itself, right? The on-time performance of the transit agency or route, or the number of crashes on this roadway corridor. Those basically all tell you kind of, they're just information about what's happening. They're not telling you about how people are experiencing that. So again, it's sort of flipping the binoculars. You need that data, right? I mean, that's important data, but alone, that data isn't informing us very much about why it's important and for whom it's important and what are the results of that data. So we tend to kind of hyper focus in our profession on just sort of fixing the numbers, getting the numbers down. And it's a little more challenging for us to ask why that's important and for whom that's important, and put that contextual story around those numbers in a systematic, you know, kind of manageable way. So let me toss it to somebody else. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Hannah and Stefanie. Yeah, I think, first of all, I think we're doing well is the fact that we're having this conversation, right? I think that's the, you know, that this has become, you know, more of a mainstream conversation to be having, that we're seeing people talking about equity, that we're having some arguments about what it is and how it fits and where it should sit within research and government and even the private sector. I do want to pick up one point where you were talking about barriers. Well, yes, we need to, but I guess my question is, like, how do we know what the barriers are, right? And so I think there's a, you know, well, yes, we need to flip the binoculars and look at it. It's that question of, are we identifying the barriers, or are the communities identifying the barriers? And so, and then how do we integrate that structure, you know, into the overall equity framework, where we still need to get, you know, down at the local level and like contextualize it at the individual level, like how you as an individual experience the barriers that are relevant to you, and yet also understanding that there are systemic barriers that we know of that are ubiquitous across multiple communities. And so it's the balancing I see of trying to, you know, how do you appropriately balance both of those dynamics so that we can get at, you know, fundamentally, what are we even considering as equity? What does it matter to an individual? What does it matter to an institution? What does it matter to a group of, you know, like-minded individuals? And how do we actually roll that into an equity framework that we're getting at a lot of these issues that isn't just a, you know, a set of 10 indicators that we're trying to apply for it to everyone? Maybe I'll actually throw that question out to the to both of you, and you know, so we can pick that apart a little bit.
Well, I don't have an answer. I think that's a question that we need to really talk about as an industry. I think one of the points there is highlighting the use and the necessity for qualitative data as well. So I know that we're all talking about equity analysis, and that's very much a, you know, quantitative quantitative process, but there's also great information that could be gained from qualitative data. And how do we use that within equity analysis, or to contextualize equity analysis, as Hannah was saying, but also how do we present qualitative analysis, qualitative data to agencies and to the research, to academia, and like how do we present this data to the point where people they respect it to the same level they respect quantitative data. And I think that's one of the challenges as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would definitely say just at a practical level, there's an awful lot of committees among the Transportation Research Board, for example, that focus on high quality survey research. You know, that I've been chair of one of the transportation planning committees at TRB for several years. And it just occurs to me, we've never interacted with those committees, you know, we've just done, in my experience. And right there, you know, there's a whole body of experts who understand how to do opinion surveys and to do experience-based surveys in a very scientific, valid way, and come up with data that you can count on. And it can be from focus groups, it can be from outreach, it can be from, you know, small samples. You don't have to make everything, you know, a 10,000 sample phone survey, you know, to have it be valid. But I think one very practical tool that just occurs to me is let's connect better between the travel modelers and the survey researchers, as well as obviously the public engagement professionals. I think another thought, Lauren, going back to your question, is that it really when you set up outcomes that you want to achieve, as we were saying earlier, that if that's kind of the measurement of success or the definition of success, and we need to define the desired outcomes with the communities that are hoping to experience those outcomes. So that's sort of step one. You can't identify the barriers until you've identified those outcomes, those desired outcomes, right? So, you know, it's meaningless to talk about barriers to something that nobody wants. So, so we can't assume, we have some ideas, but we can't assume until we really do get some consensus on what those desired outcomes are, before we then structure a needs assessment, right, that would look systematically at places where those needs or desires aren't being met, you know, and there's a gap, and then you go through a structured planning process to figure out some solutions. But that process of defining the desired outcomes with the community means that then you need to have something that's integrated with all the other, at least planning agencies in the region, right? Because those desired outcomes are going to be about, you know, the end result. I want to be able to sustain a working wage, you know, livable wage job. That's the outcome I want. You know, your part, transportation agency, of that has to, you know, you play a part in that. But improving the transit service is wonderful. It may reduce just one of the barriers I have to that outcome, but there's other barriers that the transportation agency may not have the purview, you know, or the ability to address. And the transportation agency needs to document that, so that we're describing how we're doing, you know, the part we can do, but we're also systematically and in an integrated way working with our partner agencies in land use planning and human services and, you know, economic development and community development. And that's just on the public sector side, as well as, you know, civic agencies and nonprofit groups and everybody else who makes communities work, you know, kind of needs to be involved in that planning process. So I think another sort of good strategy, I guess, is to really beef up our ability to do more integrated planning, so that the transportation plan is put into that broader context from the very beginning. And we're not binding ourselves to trying to achieve outcomes we can't achieve, but we're also not ignoring what people say they want or watering it down to the point where we're saying, okay, well, you want that outcome, we're just going to do this one little piece, and we're just going to kind of not talk about whether or not it really worked. We're not going to go back and measure that.
Yeah, so I think I just wanted to, if we're thinking about, what does success look like too? And I think if we think about different levels of government or public agency, I mean, at SumC, obviously we're working on the Clean Mobility Option Voucher Pilot Program, where we're working with very small communities, right? These are smaller, nonprofit, CBO-led projects that happens at a very hyper-local level for the most part. There's some, even within CMO, right? We have a lot of variety where even some are at public agency, municipal, county levels, and trying to understand, there's going to be different measures of success for each project and each layer too. And so I know we're thinking about Hannah, you were talking kind of from the top up, the top down perspective of at that county level or state level or an MPO level, what does success look like? But I do think there's, peeling back the layers and recognizing that there's still stratification down at the hyperlocal level as well. And that's something that I don't think is commonly part of the conversation, where we know we have achievements and outcomes at this level, but what happens at the community level? Understanding what is success for, we're also working with tribal governments as well. What does success look like for that tribe, at, a very small localized population that has specific needs? And that getting at those outcomes and at that success metric, I think those success metrics is inherently difficult because they're so, they're very delicate, I guess is the, a certain word, where we might want to, again, on the qualitative side, trying to capture that, trying to understand what the people in that community see as success and how they feel that they're being perceived within the broader, public agency structure, or, yes, we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and we want to reduce VMT and we want to do all these high level things, but what does that mean to that individual, to the groups of people that are actually participating and are the ones being measured? Quite frankly, they're the ones that are either being, or we're trying to address them through qualitative as well as quantitative metrics. And then we're rolling that up at a bigger level, but it has to come back down to local level at some point and understand what success looks like for them. And so, I mean, that's a huge part of my focus, is trying to understand how do we bring all that together and how do we actually measure success for, a very small community. And, there aren't targets at that level, I feel. Maybe this is another open topic for discussion of, we set targets, we set, outcome measures, but is it enough at the local level when we're trying to understand equity, that if one person has seen an improvement in their ability to access a transportation sector, is that good enough? And how do we, again, I'm asking more questions than giving answers, but how do we reconcile that? I think that is fundamentally, as we're talking about encoding equity and reporting on equity and measuring equity, I keep coming back to this at the individual level. How do we quantify that? How do we say that is that enough? And yet it's not going to satisfy, a public agency perspective of we need to have this integrated plan, and we need to understand that equity is, being quantified across a region. Is it enough if we're looking at a very hyper local level of analysis?
Yeah, and boy, that issue, and Stefanie mentioned the word earlier about disparity, that not only are you trying to identify in your sort of legally required process, at least for MPOs, the existence of impacts on everybody that might be negative or positive, then you have to do another level of analysis to say, is that level of impact disparately affecting one group, one of our subgroups here? So not only do barriers exist, but do the barriers exist disproportionately? And then that's when sort of the requirement to then, address it really kicks in. And so what I've found in a lot of planning documents is that, particularly with plans, it's kind of easier to do that kind of analysis, or it's more straightforward with a specific project where you're building something or constructing something. So you test for noise and air and real estate takings and, these very physical, quantifiable impacts that are hyper local, right, Lauren? They're people's houses, and they're, the 7-Eleven on the corner that's going to get taken if you do that roundabout, So there, that process is a little easier in the sense that it's so tangible. Identifying whether it's disparate or not, though, still gets you into this very weird mathematical quandary, right? Because sometimes, quite often the numbers are so small. It is 2 people versus 4 people, or, a community of this size or they're very dispersed. You get these communities that have been torn apart by a highway 50 years ago. And so they are physically located in a very raggedy way that is difficult to quantify and map, right? And so you wind up sort of appearing to not have disparities when you do, or when people tell you, no, it is. And I kind of don't care what your numbers say, it is, but legally you have to have a defensible, logical, defensible process that can't sort of, I don't know if the word sort of cater to, you don't want to cater to, you have to be fair, you have to be equitable in your process and say, I can't just go out and something's inequitable because somebody told me it was.
Well,
I have to document that a little bit better. But on the other hand, sometimes that's all the information you get. So what do you think, Stefanie?
I'm going to challenge this one, that point, because I guess it depends on who's saying that this is an issue. Because if there are groups of people who have been historically marginalized and excluded, and if they are the ones who say this is a problem, then I think that there is justification to say, okay, well, we need to step back and
that's enough information. Yeah,
that's enough to make us step back and say, all right, well, let's look at this more deeply. Then I think that that's the approach that we should be taking as well.
That's a really good point. I remember when I first went to see a nurse midwife for my women's health care instead of a male doctor. I went to a women's nurse midwife, and she wore this big button on her lab coat that said, "Listen to women." And this was like 1982 or something, and we were just coming out of Tootsie era, of if you remember that movie. But women were far less listened to then than they are now as a group, I think, in our society. And it made a huge difference to me. I was amazed at I didn't even realize how much I hadn't felt listened to as a young woman until I saw a doctor that put on her body, this is my way of interacting with you. And she would believe me when I would tell her about, problems I had that didn't sound medical. I had a dream about this problem, and sometimes that's how my body talks to me. And she took that seriously. And in fact, it actually was useful information for my health, and it was one of the ways I communicate. That's not the way everybody communicates, right? So, using that, really listening to the way people are telling you something and taking the trouble to interpret and learn about what they mean by what they say. Right.
This is a very really important point. I feel like, because and this is what I think what we don't do well. I mean, going back to the original question, is having trust. It's a two-way, trust is a two-way street. I mean, having trust in the community, that the community trusts us to hear them when they are saying what are the problems and the barriers, and that we trust the community that they know what they need. And I think, you know, we can do, I recognize that we have to have this basis of, you know, convincing other people that, you know, that this is an issue, right? There has to be something to approach policymakers and, you know, agency level individuals that this is a problem. And so maybe that, you know, it's that what we need to do better is to figure out how do we take this trust element, what the community is telling us, and be able to then tell that story and roll it up to have something that is defensible, you know, at the public agency level. And it's, you know, in one sense, it's like, again, I think we're in the middle, right? We are the intermediary that has to tell that story, which is unfortunate because it seems like in one sense, the community should be able just to say, hey, this is an issue, and have people believe them. But we're not there yet. I don't think we're quite there yet. And there has to be an intermediary that works within this space to be able to tell that story and support the community. And so I you know, I think we all play different roles in this, you know, channel of information, but to me, that is very key to all of this, because, you know, we can do transportation data, you know, demand analysis, and we can, you know, get that data. And even with shared mobility, right, it's actually becoming easier because we actually know where devices are and how people are using them and where they're traveling to. We have that hard data, but we don't have the voices of the community being elevated to a level, or, you know, we do, but maybe not very well, that pipeline of information can get through and accompany the hard data that we know we can actually create and present. And so, you know, I just feel like that, to me, like we just hit on kind of the gold mine of having the, you know, and then facilitating how do we do it. And I think there's, you know, there's a lot of different, you know, ways of integrating in the community and sharing their trust and, you know, developing a relationship, developing partners in the community that can be able to support those ideas. There's a, you know, I keep referring to in our work, culturally responsive evaluation practice, which has been about the last 20 years about understanding the cultural context of a community and baking that into your interactions. And so again, it kind of goes back to like, we have assumptions, but we need to understand within the context of the community what matters to them, what channels of communication work for them, what are the informal and formal practices that they, you know, support, and who are their voices and who are their leaders that they want to elevate and to share their message. And it is, I know in the first session, we're talking about this a little bit in the opening session, because it's really hard to do, and it's expensive and it's resource intensive. But without it, it seems to me that the long-term effects, you know, and the missed really opportunities, and it's better if we, I think there's the shift that needs to happen is focusing resources on that rather, you know, at the beginning, and getting that in place. And then I think, Stefanie, you mentioned continually going back to those communities, building those relationships over time, so that this isn't, you know, something that happens once, and then that's how you build trust too, right? That through that relationship building, identifying their cultural context and figuring out what makes those communities tick can actually build that trust over time, so that potentially and hopefully, and in my dreams, that they are the voice at a certain point, that there doesn't have to be this pipeline of information, that, you know, the communities have the ability, that they've worked with their community leaders, that they are the voice and they can be listened to, and they're not getting pushed aside, right? And this is the issue I think we've had for a long time, that they don't get heard in this process. And or someone is speaking for them, which is, you know, uncomfortable, but necessary.
I think we are,
at this
you know,
point.
this is where, as public sector agencies in the American system of government, other people speak for us, you know, and it's actually, it works that way. Like you mentioned earlier, my body language was top down, right? You know, and that our transportation planning process, you know, rolls up ultimately to federal level approval. You know, and they're looking at it from you know, inside. Most of us are at one time or another feel sort of dominated by a legal system. We're all kind of afraid of getting sued, you know, or something. So sometimes it comes down to, you know, just don't do it wrong, but we get so afraid of doing it wrong that we don't do it right. We know we're not doing it right, but we can't figure out how to do it right and legally, and I'm not saying you have to break the law to do things better, but in the process of sort of rolling everything up into the jargon and the official speak, and the model data and everything else that we're supposed to wrap our plans in, I find myself constantly having to really discipline myself to document what people say the way they say it and not the way I heard it. That I have my own personal bias, that's baked into my own personality from my own personal history. So if you tell me something and I write it down and quote you, chances are I'm going to correct your grammar without even thinking about it. I will do it so subconsciously because I was an English major in college, but that one step of just correcting your grammar when I translate what you say could completely undermine the meaning of what you were saying, because I've now turned it into a jargon, then I usually go another step and turn it into planning jargon of some sort or something. So I've done things like use word clouds and stuff, of transcripts of what I've heard recorded, and do that just to see, am I unintentionally misrepresenting people simply by trying to sort of package up and, pun intended, whitewash what what people say.
This makes me think of, I guess this is more of a question, maybe a recommendation or suggestion, I don't know. But thinking about the equity analysis and turning data into information. So I think a lot of times we kind of rely on data to give us the answer. So if we're, putting data into a model and then something comes out that's also data, but then not taking the time to understand, well, what does that mean? How do we contextualize that? What is the information that we're actually gaining from that data? And I think it's important to be able to contextualize it, but then as you were talking, Hannah, it also made me think of, well, how are we contextualizing it? Who should be contextualizing it? Because in our cases, if we're doing an equity analysis, maybe the planners or the engineers who are doing this analysis who are going to then contextualize it. But is that something that needs to be done with the community? Like even if we're still kind of playing that intermediary, but how do we make sure that when we're contextualizing it, we're doing that properly as well? How are we interpreting that information really?
Yeah, I'm seeing a couple questions, I think, in the chat. And Stefanie, you might want to just continue on. Take a look at some of those questions, because people were asking a couple of things about your work and they're relevant.
I really liked one of the first ones that came in. So when you're speaking to looking at the community's specific need for kind of improving services where there weren't before. So there's that, and there's the more abstract impacts and changes that we think a lot about in the field, like fare integration, mode integration, multimodalism, these sort of hallmarks that we think about moving towards as we want to move towards MOS, which is, so how do we kind of decide on what to weigh or prioritize as we're thinking about that?
Stefanie, you go first.
I was hesitating because I don't know that I have an answer, but I guess when it comes, I think prioritization is always challenging because whose priorities are we talking about? And I think, and I guess maybe this is maybe a residual of the question I just asked, trying to kind of parse out in my head, what does it mean to contextualize information that we're getting? and who should be doing that. So thinking like in terms of prioritization, I think that, you know, agencies and planners and the folks who are not necessarily in the community can think, can see broadly what some priorities might be, but it's incredibly important to understand what the community sees as priorities. And as Hannah was saying, it's likely that it's not just the transportation system that they have priorities for. So it's not just, you know, congestion, but it's how do I get to work? I need to, you know, reach, like not just reach my job, but to have the job that will allow me to improve my quality of life. So there's, I don't know that I'm going to answer this question. Like I'm kind of just making it more complicated and difficult, but just kind of bringing up some of the things that are swimming around in my head right now, of how do we identify priorities and make sure that those priorities are those most important to the community.
What do you think, Lauren?
So I think from my personal priority about not counting, trying to, you know, understand is really just to improve access for people who don't have access. I think that is sort of the first step. And obviously, you know, I think before we get to more abstractions and, you know, we can continue working on those, but I think at the community level, try to understand if you don't have access right now, what does that mean? And it gets to your point, Stefanie, of how does this improve my quality of life? You know, so in socioeconomic benefits and economic spillover, and you can get into all of those sort of components of this. But, you know, I was talking with someone recently and they had a proposal on the table that was focused on a particular element, and I won't go into too many details, but the point was, well, we're counting this the same across all these different dimensions because we know for a fact that people who live in this kind of community or don't travel as much, like they don't have as high a VMT. And so we're not going to behold this sort of development to higher standards because, you know, we don't want to get in the way of development by putting on all these, you know, additional levels of requirements. And I was thinking to myself, well, that means because they don't have access, they don't have the ability to go anywhere. And so, like, again, it's the disconnect of like, what was the priority there? The priority there was like, yes, there's all these other elements and dimensions of society that we need to, you know, be sufficient, but they also don't have simply, they don't have as much, they don't drive as much, they don't travel as much because they don't have access to transportation, they don't have cars, they don't have access to shared mobility services, you know, there's, and even if you look at the transit side, like they don't use transit as much either in this particular example. And so it was like, to me, the priority is we identifying the community needs, but focusing in on, if you don't have access, then what does that mean? And how do you support that within the community context? And then figure out, okay, what's the next step? Or can we even leapfrog? You know, can we leapfrog to a new technology that's going to address this? And how do we fit in new technology into this space? But recognizing that, to me, the fundamental element is, if you don't have access, how do we solve that?
Mm-hmm. And differentiating between choices and forces, right? So, you know, I think one of the assuming that the existing condition is okay, assuming that because you're not seeing people doing something, they don't want to do it, that's a great checkpoint. And again, something that I think we found in our research, that in a sort of systematic equity analysis framework, you look at the needs of the community before you start testing alternative solutions, and you try to identify the gaps and so forth. And one of the breakdowns we saw in our research was that the agencies might do a nice job of identifying needs, many of which are based in a long history of being marginalized, or, you know, the highway bisecting the neighborhood 50 years ago, you know, so these are old entrenched, baked in problems. And then what happens is, just technically in the analysis at later stages of testing alternatives in the future, you try, you know, analyzing the impacts of 20-year future projects, they sort of only get tested against the now. And it's sort of as if, does it make it better? or does it, it doesn't even ask, does it make it better? It just says, does it not make it worse? Right. So our process as it is currently sort of mapped out, in a regulatory kind of way, and we're not necessarily required to do it this way, but it's sort of the practice, is just to sort of try to do no harm. But we don't sort of go back, and even when we acknowledge that there are those needs and there are those impacts, are just sort of the mechanics of at least regional planning is such that I find that we wind up just sort of assuming that the base case of the now is okay. And we don't have to fix what's wrong. We just we just try to, not make it worse. And that's not enough. I do think the new the Biden administration and the priorities of this particular, federal makeup are changing that. They're pushing us more on that and saying it's not enough to just do no harm. We do have to really substantively invest and make it better and right some wrongs. But that's a fairly new thing in the conversation.
And I just want to add that we do like a plan every 5 to 10 years, and every 5 to 10 years we're looking at the current versus the future, as opposed to like, okay, so we did this plan 5 years ago. What was that? What were the targets that we set for equity? How did we change against that? So even seeing if we've improved, or looking back, like even currently saying, okay, we're going to do this plan now. Are we maintaining that information? Are we holding on to that data so that way the next time we do the planning effort, we can compare against what we had the last planning effort?
Did we make a difference? Yeah. Do we analyze the benefits of what we did and use that as a decision-making resource going forward? Yeah, good point.
Thank you all so much for a really fantastic conversation, bringing up some topics that could be entire sessions themselves, certainly.